uh, actually starting in verse 13. But because Hebrews is all one, it's all together, at the top is sort of a review from last week. So it's like reading a 3-page email, but you only do a paragraph a week. So the chapter 6, 9 through 12, he's telling us, okay, remain faithful. They're suffering, they're being persecuted. And so these 4 reasons to remain faithful. One, that God promises a better future. There's better things. There's an eternity. There's a heaven. And until we get there, God remembers your works of faith and their love. So you're not alone. God is a loving, caring Father who remembers your faithfulness to him. And therefore, we're to remain persistent in our faith, and we are to imitate others. So in chapter 6, verse 12, he says, "But imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises." And this is when you stop and you say, well, who's he referring to? And then in verse 13 says, "For when God made the promise to Abraham." So this is what I was thinking. I was at a half-price bookstore. If you haven't been to one, they're great. But the one I go to has like maybe one main aisle on books on the Bible or theology. But the section on Christian living, there's 3 or 4 times more books on Christian living. And I think both are, well, some are live and some are not, authors, and they're telling you how to live a Christian life. So I was thinking, if you had to recommend to somebody, okay, here's somebody you should listen to or read to help you understand the Christian life. So then you say, well, let's do somebody who's died. So we can go C.S. Lewis, Bonhoeffer, we can go back further. And then if you say, well, you need to learn about or read about somebody who was there when Jesus was alive. So we'll pick Peter, Paul, John. They'd be great people to learn how to live the Christian life. Now, my perspective, I thought, well, if you could, not going to be a lot advantageous to pick somebody in the Old Testament because obviously they weren't alive when Jesus was, and so they don't have the full New Testament. But if you had somebody, I thought, well, let's do Isaiah or Jeremiah. They did prophecies about him. At least they had heard the biblical story up to that. But the further you get back in the Old Testament, the further you get away from someone who obviously knew Jesus or heard about Jesus. So he's going to go back all the way to Abraham. So this is what I was thinking. If you think about the story of Abraham and when he gets the call to help us try to walk in his shoes, think about that the only part of the Bible that you have is Genesis 1 through 11. And that you know nothing else after Genesis 12, which is what Abraham would have. So then you think about how much Abraham didn't know and how much we know. So as I was thinking about this, I thought, well, how can he help us how to live the Christian life when he not only have personal experiences with Jesus, but he didn't know much even about the Old Testament? What is Abraham going to tell us about how to live the Christian life in 2026? So, as my mind is, as I went to see a friend of mine today, I was in the car and I said, what if Abraham were sitting in my car? He just shows up, or in your car, and you have to explain to him what's going on. This is when you have an ADD mind. I thought, you have to. He go, where's the camels? What are those cars? And then try to explain. Well, there's this thing called the church. Well, what's that? And then they got to explain. Well, there's the nation of Israel. What's that? I mean, all the stuff you'd have to fill him in on. So I was intrigued as, why is Abraham going to help us understand how to live the Christian life today? And I will tell you, for me, maybe it won't be for you, but for me, this has been a surprise story. And there's some parts of Hebrews that I know, well and sort of anticipate. This isn't one of them where I thought, okay, because it's a small passage. But he's going to hopefully lay out what are we going to learn about Abraham in how to live the Christian life. So, verse 13 and 14. The first is that God made a promise to Abraham. And so remember, the rest that he promised to Abraham, which was the land. For us, the rest is heaven. So as we're going through this, every time he talks about Abraham, you're going to be a great nation, and you're going to have a land. For us, that's a parallel to, okay, we're going to heaven. Okay? I know. So he says, for when God made the promise to Abraham, so God has made a promise to us about heaven. And since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself. I swear to God, I'm swearing to myself, saying, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply you. Now, at first thought, I thought, well, you guys are all Bible, you know this story. And I thought, there's not really need to sort of go back and retrace the story of Abraham. And so at first, I wasn't. I thought, well, I know the story of Abraham. So I thought, well, maybe I'll go back. So I started Genesis 11, went through Genesis 25, reread the story again, but in light of Hebrews. And again, this is where, for me, a new enlightenment as to things that were in the story that I've forgotten about or maybe trying to fully understand. So that's what we're going to do. Now, we're not going to go through a lot of this in detail because you know the stories, but I'm going to try to pick out high points of the story of Abraham to point back as to why Abraham is a great person to start with, to imitate. So, he gives him a promise, an oath. He swore by himself, I promise you that I will surely bless you and make you and surely multiply you. So, the first part is you read the story about his father, and his father dies, and so forth. But then within boldface it says, he sticks it in there and says, now Sarai was barren, and she had no child. And so that is given to us before God calls him. So then, they tell the story, and I forgot about it. They had already started. They left Ur of Chaldees. They stopped in Haran. His father dies. And then the call of Abraham, when the Lord appears to him, go from your country and your kindred and your family's house to the land that I will show you. So number one, he's never seen it. That's us. We've never seen heaven. And then he gives him the six benefits. I'll make you into a great nation, but his wife can't have children. I will bless you. For them, you have family and also possessions. I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. He's a nomad, lives in east part of the Middle East. I will bless those who bless you. And so not only he'll be so blessed, but he'll bless anyone that comes in contact with him. But then he says, in him who dishonors you, I will curse. This is quite an amazing blessing. And then, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's us. So I'm trying to think. So Abraham hears this promise and think, okay, so how much would he have understood? So again, if you just stop the Bible at Genesis 12 and don't have the rest of the Bible and all that we understand, 2,000 years of church history, that he's given him a promise that really would be impossible for him to understand. I mean, if Abraham, just to try to understand what the land is going to look like under the reign of King David. And he's never been to this land. So it's a promise. And I was thinking about promises. And so I should tell my students, those of you who are teachers, study hard, work hard, and you too can fulfill all your dreams. I promise you, you can do well. Okay? Not true, but in some cases. Okay? But this is a promise that's impossible. So if you tell someone, I don't know, I'm trying to think, you promise something to someone that you know is impossible, you'd almost think, well, that's almost rude to promise somebody some great success if you know for sure that it could never come about. And in a sense, that's what the promise is. So you might think, okay, God's, given him a promise. I promise you, Abraham, but it's an impossibility. It's almost in my mind is, so what's so great about this promise? Because I can't understand it. So then, it's verse 15. The Hebrew writer just says, and so, having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. Of course, we know the story of what that meant. But when Abraham received the call, he wouldn't have. He had no idea how long this was going to take, not just in his own life. And so I wrote next to that, this promise is absurd to me. That to say that the way to obtain this promise is to patiently wait. So you're going to patiently wait for something that's never going to happen. I mean, when I was younger, I wanted to play professional football. I really thought I could. In high school, I was like 50, 60 pounds skinnier than I am now. And I had a friend of mine in high school. He said, Doug, you're going to have to gain a bunch of weight and lift weights if you want to play high school football, let alone professional football. Again, from a human perspective, I think there's absolutely no way for him to even consider patiently waiting on this promise to come about. And that's important to this story, that this is absurd. So, Genesis 12, right after he gives the promise, is verse 4. It says, and Abraham went. Now, those of you who have, gone overseas, either on vacation or have lived, when you think about, what that was like to move someplace new, even if it's someplace across the country. So Abraham is leaving. He doesn't have brochures or pictures of what this land is going to look like. He leaves. And this helps us understand something about Abraham that I thought. I know far more about God than he does, and yet the foundation of Abraham's faith is really what God wants us to understand. Why would he go? Okay. And he's 75 years old. And since some of you are older than me, you can more relate to this. So here's the first thing.
Then 75 wasn't that old.
No, I know. But I thought, so even before he's going to, I got a promise from this God that's going to bless me. He still, instead, waited 75 years to get the call. So it didn't happen when he was 20. And you get near the end of our lives, as we are, you think, okay, Lord, it's about done. And then all of a sudden, oh no, I got something grand for you to do. So he's 75, takes Lot, which he actually wasn't supposed to. And it says, and he came to the land of Canaan, so he passed through the land, and at the time the Canaanites were in the land. So he's walking through the land, and then he sees the people who are living there. Is there any historical Sharon story, where, Columbus arrives or the Spaniards arrive in South America, where there's all these native people who live there? And what are you going to do with them? So Abraham's going to go to a land, but it's not a vacant lot where he can just move in. And that's significant. So, Lord, I've traveled over, hundreds and hundreds of miles to get here, and then when he arrives, it's already filled with people who live there. How in the world is he going to inherit this land? And this is the part, okay, we'll go to page 2. And it says, and then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring I will give this land. Well, his wife's barren. And here, sort of a second sign of Abraham's faith. So he built an altar. What you might expect him to have done is, and so he complained to God and said, why in the world have you brought me here? So he builds an altar. Okay, then from there he moved to the hill country, and he built another altar. And then he called upon the name of the Lord, and then he journeyed on. So he journeyed, built an altar, a worship to God, recognition of who he is, journeyed some more, altar, and journeyed some more. This is the introduction of Abraham's, this is absurd. Absurd. So it isn't just that he gave him a promise, he gave him a promise with an oath. So he says, for men, verses 16 and 17, for men swear by one greater than themselves, and with them an oath given as confirmation is an end of every dispute. Okay. In the same way, God, desiring even more to show to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, he interposed with an oath. And I've seen little comedy routines about God swearing to himself. I swear to myself. So it isn't just he made a promise, he made this oath. And by swearing, if you will, by himself, is saying that this promise that he made to Abraham comes from the highest authority. Abraham, you can trust this promise, even though it's absurd. But it's what he promised. Unchangeableness of his purpose. God isn't going to call Abraham and then somewhere down the road say, oh, Abraham, I've changed the plan. Or, yeah, I promise you this. Right? We do that sometimes with the kids. We promise them this, and then it doesn't work out. So, I didn't meet the promise. But really, next week, God's not going to change the promise that he made to Abraham. So think of it this way. Abraham's thinking, you know, Lord, if I do this, how can I trust that this is going to come to fruition? And he's saying, no, I'm going to give you an oath that it's unchangeable. So, in the Genesis account, it's in Genesis 15, and I'm going to go through it quickly. When God appears to him, okay, fear not, Abraham, okay. Abraham says, look, I'm childless. And then God says, 1, 2, 3, 4, the sixth bullet point. Then God said to him, so shall your offspring be. He said, look toward the heaven, the number of the stars, if you're able to number them, and so shall your offspring be. He still has a barren wife. And then it says, and he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness, which is then found in Romans. And that's the example Paul uses to what it means to be justified by faith. And he uses Abraham as an example. He believed the Lord, and the Lord said, in essence, you've been declared righteous. You've been declared justified. And we would say, Abraham, you've been saved. I don't know. What do you think? I as I rethink of that, I just thought, this is absurd. That's the point. You'd almost think it'd be at the end of Abraham's life when God would say, very good, Abraham. He tells him early on at the beginning of this process, oh, so you believe me? Good. I'll count you justified. I'll count you righteous. Which, guys, help us understand when we talk about what Jesus has forgiven you. When you know, particularly for those of you who've made professions of faith when you're younger. How could a Lord forgive somebody who's, I don't know, 9, 10, 11 years old? So then he says, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of Chaldees. And then listen to Abraham's question. O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? Because he's seen the enemies. And then you listen to God's response. Okay, bring a heifer, bring a female goat 3 years old, bring a ram 3 years old, bring a turtle dove and a young pigeon. And then we have the sacrificial sacrifice that precedes Moses. So he takes the animals, cuts them in half, except the birds. Abraham falls asleep. Okay. And it's in the process of this Abraham being asleep and this animal sacrifice. Now look at what the Lord says to Abraham. Know for certain that your offspring, like, okay, my offspring is going to enter the land, will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Abraham, you're never going to see the fulfillment of this, because the fulfillment of the land is going to come after the 400 years, and Moses leads them through the wilderness into the promised land under Joshua. Besides the fact, Abraham, your descendants are going to be enslaved. And again, I'm trying to put myself in Abraham's shoes of thinking, I don't know, God, but following you're trying to obey this promise and fulfill it, it's impossible, but it's also terrifying, and it's full of pain and suffering, and it's not what maybe I thought it would be. But then he says, but I will bring judgment, and then there'll be you'll possess the land, and you will die in peace, and you'll be buried in a good old age, and they will come back. So, yes, Abraham, believe the promise, just that you won't experience it. So it's one thing to say to my college students, work hard, maybe 4 or 5 years you'll get a good job. But to promise something to someone at age 18, knowing that they will never see it. Most of the time we say, well, Yeah, it might take you, a couple years, or maybe it'll take you, if you're an athlete, take you another 5, 10 years, or even, whatever. But hopefully you think at some point that they'll be able to see the promise. I almost thought, is that sort of, I don't know, mean to promise something to someone knowing they'll never see it. Abraham, he tells him right front, Abraham, you're never going to see this. So again, as I'm walking through this, I'm thinking, I'm going back home. So then it says, on that day the Lord made a covenant, and that's the oath, and to your offspring I will give this land. And he gives, so he tells them all. So when he says, how will I know that I will possess this land? The answer is one, well, you will possess it, but it's going to be preceded by enormous trauma, suffering. So he gives Abraham a promise. We have a promise. He gives us an oath with a promise. We have an oath, if you will, covenant. But then God gives Abraham to help him understand how to have hope in a promise that seems impossible. So he says, so that by two unchangeable things in which it's impossible for God to lie, it's a reference back to the two unchangeable things are God gave him a promise and he gave us an oath. God gave us a promise of salvation in Jesus. He gave us an oath, which is sealed. It was sealed with the Holy Spirit, sort of our circumcision. Okay, God doesn't lie. And then he says, we who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us. So Abraham, you need to have hope in this promise. But then he describes who the hope is for. And he says, this is for Abraham, but he also says, we who have taken refuge. So people who are fleeing something and going someplace to be safe. There were cities of refuge. But think about this for a moment. It's not, if you will, the entire biblical story. It's a story of refuge where people are fleeing to go somewhere to be protected and saved. And that, in a sense, the whole biblical story is God is leading us on this journey. We're fleeing, sin. We're fleeing Satan. We're fleeing evil. And God is taking us to this place of refuge, which for us is heaven. And so this idea, well, I'm a Christian now, so why is my Christian life hard and difficult, and times I doubt God, as if it's unusual? Instead of saying, no, it's what is standard. So here's the question. How in the world can you and I have hope when we look around and say, I don't see any hope? So then I was thinking, why do you need hope? So if you were watching, I'm not a big baseball fan, I was until I moved here, but in 2011, right when the Cardinals won the World Series, we went to Game 1. Didn't we go to Game 1? So all through the game, the 7th series, particularly the 6th game when we almost lost, you're hoping. But of course, once they win, the hope is gone. So here's something just I was thinking about. The Bible talks a lot about we need hope. And I thought, what does that imply except that when we arrive in heaven, I don't need hope anymore? But if I need hope now, does it not imply or directly relate to I need hope because our lives are painful, difficult, challenging, discouraging? What else? What other negative things you want to talk about? And I know, you want to be, churches want to be uplifting, but the very nature that we need hope built into that is because life is so difficult that you and I, on many occasions, will say to God, I'm done. For whatever reason. So he wants to understand, how do we develop hope? Well, here's Genesis 17. Here's 3 things that happened to Abraham. And by the way, these are very tangible things that God does for Abraham to help him develop hope, that a hope will help us develop hope. The first thing he does, now first of all, he's 99 years old. That's my first thing. He's been waiting 24 years. The next time you're at the doctor's office and you've got to wait an hour, We just read this. 24 years. How am I going to become a father of a great nation? I don't have any children. 24 years. So the first thing he does is he changes his name to Abram to Abraham. That's important. Okay? Because he says, no longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. This isn't just like, you become a Christian and change your name. But it is important for us as Christians to realize the names that Jesus refers to us as, of who we are in him. To be constantly reminded, I'm a child of the King. To be constantly saying that, it's just a name, but it's who we are. Second, he says, as for you, you shall keep my covenant. Well, he hasn't, it's not like Moses, he hasn't laid out all the rules yet. But Abraham, if you're going to keep this promise, you're going to have to remain faithful and follow me. So if we're going to receive eventual eternal rest, it is discipleship, remaining faithful, continuing to do that. It isn't just I'm a Christian, I can sit back and do nothing. And the third thing is, most bizarre, is circumcision. So how in the world is circumcision going to be a picture of him to develop hope? And I just remember I remember being in Hebrews class and being in Bible college. Just going, this is the craziest, crazy thing to do. So here's a couple things. And is the promise to Adam and Eve was be fruitful and multiply. And to Abraham, he's going to have this great family. Well, his wife can't have children. So in a sense, to be circumcised is this literal physical representation that when he has relations with Sarah, that it's going to be the process by which God is going to bring about the promise. But probably more importantly, he's going to be blessed through blood. So I always refer to my medical people about circumcision.
You want us to
Yes.
describe it?
Well, no, I don't. No, Pam. I just wonder what people, I know, particularly maybe people outside the church, maybe you come across who, think, what a
Some of them have problems. that
weird practice. What?
Some of them have problems that
Yeah.
require circumcision.
So we talked about having hope in Jesus. It isn't just why I hope and hope. He gives Abraham these three tangible things. You got a new name, you got to obey my covenant, and then I'm going to give you this process of circumcision. They're reminders to Adam or to Abraham. One of them we have tonight will be the Lord's Supper. So then he says, he's going to describe what this hope is. Verse 19. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, stability, a hope with sure, it's trusted, and steadfast. It's consistent. So God wants to develop in us a hope that is stable. So the anchor, when we're in the midst of life in the sea, the anchor keeps us rooted in him in the midst of the sea. We can trust it, and that God is consistent. So here it is, 24 years later, when he finally tells Abraham, it's in three stages. First, he tells Abraham, this is in chapter 17, that you're going to have a son. Okay? It's going to be Isaac. It's going to be a miracle. Then, and he tells that to Abraham. The second one is when the angels come, the men come, to talk about the birth of Isaac. Sarah then hears it, laughs. So now he's going to, in a sense, tell Sarah, okay, you're going to have a son. And then finally, top of page 4 is the third time, finally, a year later, when Abraham is 100 years old, so 25 years later, Isaac is finally born. In other words, Isaac is the literal evidence that Abraham can trust God, because there's Isaac, which is a miracle. Okay. So in other words, there's a process. He doesn't just tell Abraham, just believe me without evidence. He gives him evidence. And that same way through Christ, he wants us to have hope in him and gives us evidence along the way. Then he says, now this is where the writer of Hebrews is going to connect us to Jesus. That God sent his son to enter the veil. So verse 19, he then says, so when you're saying this hope we have, okay, as one who enters within the veil where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us. So Jesus has gone before us, went to the cross, paid the price, we're sacrificed, forgiven by his sins. So now the writer of Hebrews is saying that our hope for us is built on Jesus. Abraham doesn't know that. Except when you read the story of Abraham taking Isaac to sacrifice him. There's the story right there. You see the death and resurrection that, in a sense, Isaac is going to die, if you will. He's resurrected in the sense that he provides the ram. That, in fact, he even says, oh, you're willing to kill your only son. I mean, he without Abraham understanding it, he's giving Abraham this picture of what the hope is based on. And for us, it's like, oh, that our hope is grounded in Jesus. So when Paul writes in Romans, present yourselves a living sacrifice. That's what this is. So it's not only a picture of what Jesus did on the cross, but it's also a picture of foreshadowing to discipleship that we, in a sense like Isaac, we offer a sacrifice, but it's a living sacrifice. And so he's describing to Abraham, and now to us, that how we're saved by Jesus and discipleship. This is the best part. This is the last part of verse 20. And this Jesus, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, which in chapter 7 he'll explain. And then when you go back to Genesis 14, there's a war going on. They capture Lot. Abraham goes, rescues Lot. And after he rescues Lot and wins all these goods of the prize, out of nowhere, it just says, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, most likely Jerusalem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And what that means is, as we'll learn later, is that we don't know where he came from. He just meets this king, who's also a priest, and he blessed him. And Melchizedek says to Abraham, blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. How does he know about Yahweh? And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abraham gave him a tenth. And Abraham, in a sense, worships and recognizes Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is a foreshadow of Jesus. So, this is what I want to share with you. There were at least 6, what I would say, tangible evidences of the hope that he gave to Abraham. He saw the land. He saw the animal sacrifices. Circumcision he could see. He saw Isaac being born. He saw the sacrifice of Isaac. And then he saw Melchizedek. There were 6 things historically that Abraham experienced. And likewise, we have a long list of evidences. Jesus' birth, his ministry, his miracles, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, the coming of the Holy Spirit, the church, the scriptures. There's a whole line of evidence that when we say, how can you believe in Jesus? There's a whole list of evidences to say, this isn't just pie in the sky stuff. But this is where we're going. As I went through this section of Abraham, I counted, maybe there's more, at least 13 times that God kept telling Abraham, I'm going to give you this promise. And I remember thinking, why does he keep telling him? He keeps telling him. Obvious reasons of how often you and I need to be reminded. But then I went through and I said, what obstacles did Abraham have to endure? 1, it wasn't until he was 75 years old. 2, his wife is barren. 3, he's told about this inheritance, which are going to be a future people that are going to be in captivity, that he's never going to see. he ends up having to go to Egypt because there's a famine. He lies about his wife and almost gets Sarah killed. He comes back. There's a dispute between Lot and Abraham's herdsmen, so they separate. Okay. Then there's a war going on in the land, which then resulted in Lot being captured. So Abraham goes in and then has to go and rescue Lot. Later, when he hears about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then obviously learns that Lot's wife is killed. Okay. Then Sarah gives him Hagar to have a child, which is then she's going to send him away, which is going to create conflict between Ishmael. And then at age 100, 25 years later, Isaac is finally born. It would be another 40 years. Abraham is now 140 years old when Isaac is finally married. So he's 140. Isaac is finally married. The promise is going to go through Isaac. And remember, Abraham went and found a wife for him. His servant went and found Isaac a wife. Only to find out she's barren. Now, I'm going to stop here. Part of me is as I try to relive this story, I just think, really, God? This is absurd that this promise is ever going to happen. And in the human way of thinking, I can't think of one even halfway decent reason why he would ever have believed. Because I don't think there is any. And yet he did. So in any of those times, and there's probably multiple times for us, but in those many, many times in your Christian life when you have thought to yourself or to someone else, like, I'm done. God doesn't make sense. Why does God allow this? Why does Jesus do this? Why did people in your family die, lose your job, conflict? It doesn't matter what it is. When you have said, Lord, this just makes, it's crazy. Of why, to me, Abraham really is the beginning of this. Because I thought if anybody had a reason to stop, it's him. So here's the end of the story. Genesis 25, verse 7. And these are the days of Abraham's life, 175 years old. So the process of the promise was 100 years. Called at age 75, he dies at 175. So I hadn't even been a Christian 100 years, and I'm not 100 years old. So Abraham's gone through this for 100 years. And you say, Lord, I've waited 100 years, and I've gone through all this chaos, and I can't experience it. And then it says, he died in a good old age. It's not how we mean it. Of good being like in Genesis. Abraham was a good, not perfect, but he was a good man after God's own heart. Then it says, he was an old man and he was full of years. His 100 years they're not described as 100 years of pain and suffering, they were, but they're described as full because of his endurance, his patience. And he was gathered to his people. So, again, just for me personally, this going back and revisit just shocked me because I thought, wow, this idea that he had it easy and that it's the other way around. So in the midst of, people we turn to, Abraham's a good place to start. As to why, yeah.
I did a study a while back about who was around